I felt a profound sense of shame. I felt the weight of stigma.
So here's my question. My question is, how come when people have mental damage, it's always an act of imagination? How come every other organ in your body can get sick and you get sympathy except the brain?
Can changing how you think about stress make you healthier?
But my point is, if we don't talk about this stuff and we don't learn how to deal with our lives, it's not going to be 1 in 4. It's going to be 4 in 4.
Our mental struggles do not detract from our virility, nor does our trauma taint our strength.
But that's what we need to do. We need to be involved, show our concern, don't be afraid to ask, make it your business.
You're saying that you can trust yourself to handle life's challenges. And you're remembering that you don't have to face them alone.
Is this new, fast-paced, switched-on world we live in driving us crazy? Post-millennials and Generation Z are physically safer and more connected than ever before, and yet we appear to be on the verge of a mental health crisis. According to the World Health Organization, 10 to 20% of children and young adults experience mental health problems every day. Internationally, adolescent health is affected by issues ranging from child poverty and migration to smartphone use and interaction through social media. The phrase mental health crisis is echoing around the globe as governments, media outlets and NGOs struggle to define and deal with this ever-complex issue. This panel aims to unpack the current state of our mental health and ask if it's possible to develop a toolkit to stay sustainably healthy. My name is Isaac Glover, and to help us diagnose this issue and develop this toolkit, we have 5 amazing speakers with us today, starting with, on my left, Dr. Brandi Eijsermans, a trained clinical psychologist with over 10 years of experience spanning the world, specializing in people who live outside their country of origin and managing their dynamic identities. Next to Brandi, we have Mr. Kenneth Radford. Kenneth started People in Gardens, a social enterprise dedicated to using horticulture as a medium to enable people with physical or mental impairments to take back control of their lives. Next to Ken, we have Mr. William Stubbs. Will is a co-founder and director of Spurs, a group of organizations working towards a world that is fair, sustainable, and well. Will is also a 2018 Global Shaper and spoke at the World Economic Forum last year on youth depression, in addition to being nominated for awards such as the Australian Mental Health Prize. Next to Will, we have Mr. Cathal Murphy. Cathal's documentary, Our Mental Health, was broadcast on Irish national television and covers the personal stories of people of the same age and their experiences with mental health. And on the far left, we have Bea Fouqueret. As our student speaker, Bea is a grade 11 student who has written a book based on her personal experience with issues surrounding mental health and has volunteered to share her experiences with us today. Please give our speakers a round of applause. So to sort of get this discussion going, we'd like to start with a pretty baseline question, and I'd like to start with Bea on this as our student speaker. I've stated that we're on the verge of a mental health crisis. Would you agree with this statement?
I think we are calling it a crisis now because we're finally aware of it, but I think it's been such a taboo topic that people refuse to accept that there was mental health issues before, and so it's been a crisis for a lot longer than the past 10 years, I think.
Definitely. And the rest of you like to comment as well? Or?
To answer it simply, yes, it is a crisis. And even looking at statistics of youth's issues with mental well-being and mental illness, declining mental health has been increasing for years. In fact, at the same pace that social media has been taken up, which is an interesting correlation. But yes, youth now are more lonely, more isolated, have higher rates of depression, anxiety, and stress than ever before. In Korea, if you're up to the age of 30, the number one way you'll die is suicide. If you're in Australia, as a male, the number one way you'll die is suicide. That can't be normal. That surely isn't normal. And so I think the only way to answer that question is mental health at a crisis state for youth is yes. But I think be spot on that it probably has been happening for some time, but we didn't have the words and the language on how to articulate that. There was a speaker that I'm going to quote and steal this insightful comment from about years ago, a researcher at University of Sydney. She talked about how society tackles one major health crisis at a time. Years ago, for instance, AIDS was an issue, but we weren't ready to talk about that. We weren't ready to discuss that publicly. There was a large taboo around that. As that started to recede, we were able to actually tackle that as a society. We then had cancer, which once upon a time wasn't something you would like to talk about. It was quite a taboo topic. Now that's a very open discussion we can have, and we can actually start tackling that as a society. In Australia, you're taught as a kid to slip, slop, slap, which any Australians here will know exactly what I mean, which is to slip on a shirt, slap on a hat, and slap on some sunscreen. Remember that? But as youth now, you're not taught, as you're growing up, what is the equivalent of cancer safety for mental health. And I think we have created a world where it is causing a lot of problems for youth that they don't know how to deal with.
I would agree with that. I mean, what we do know is that this generation is the least likely of all generations to report having good or excellent mental health. We know, these are some of the numbers that you were quoting are on the conservative side. Some of the recent research shows that up to 91% of people in your generation are reporting that their physical and emotional stress is a daily experience. And so, as Bea was saying, when we normalize that, when we buy into this silencing of this conversation, we have silent suffering that's going on. And this is a very real level of suffering that we cannot ignore anymore. It is, you can talk about systems, the less that we talk about it and the less that we recognize that it is a crisis, the more that we normalize this and say that this level of stress, both physical and emotional, is normal, and that's absolutely couldn't be further from the truth. And so the path forward is figuring out what can we do. We're integrating technologies that we don't know the full scope of how it impacts our health. We also have sleep and exercise deeply impacted by those systems as well. And that's just for those of us that are visible within society and within these systems. We have the intersectionality of so many people who are not visible. And in fact, one of the primary issues that we talk about as an issue is that the sense of discrimination and social awareness impacting mental health is on the rise. And this shows, again, how silencing and feeling disconnected from this conversation really does impact us in a negative way. And especially when we're modeling that for generations to come. We haven't figured it out yet.
So, Brandi, talking about exposure and silent suffering, Cathal, with your documentary that you made, would you say that that's the best way to sort of help dispose of this silent suffering, to get people's stories out there?
Definitely it helps, yeah. It's mostly shame was the factor that prevented people from opening up. I'm not too sure why there's so much shame attached to it. Perhaps shame is one of the factors in poor mental health developing in the first place, so maybe it's connected to that. But after we did our documentary, definitely the amount of feedback we got, where people were just delighted to have permission that it was okay not to be okay, the amount of people who were suffering in silence purely because they didn't want to be ostracized. or treated differently, you know. So yeah, it's events like this, and the more you talk, you'd be surprised how much you inspire others to do the same.
And Ken, with your work with People's Garden, just seeing people both on a daily basis and visitors, and would you say, with experience with sort of both camps, is the taboo fading that Cathal's spoken about?
No, I didn't. But before I answer the question, we were talking this morning, and we thought we'd set you a little task, and that we need an ending to a joke. And the beginning of the joke is a mad Australian, a mad Irishman, and a mad Englishman sat in a mental health panel forum. And we'd like to know what the punchline is for that joke. So,
I think the punchline is Brandi and B saying.
Probably. So I had a heart attack 6 months ago, and I've been going through this emotional sort of stress, and as part of that, I needed to go and visit my old housemaster from school, who was a really important part of my life from 1966 to 73. Just needed to reconnect with him, and he was telling me all about the pupils in my year, and I remember saying to him, Christ, we were a pretty screwed up lot, weren't we, really? Looking back, we probably were, because we all had different issues. I spoke last night about my time in a psychiatric hospital. I'd lost 14 members of family and friends over quite a short period of time, and it finally peaked for me when my son was born, and I missed my father so much that I used to say goodbye to my wife and go and sit in the park. I never used to go to work, I just wanted to keep myself safe. And one thing that I've found through my work is that it isn't just your generation that might be in crisis. There seems to be a crisis in lots of generations, and whether it is a crisis or not, I don't know. One thing is definitely in crisis is the services that support people who have mental health issues. They did a survey recently in England. 99% of the GPs, it's a huge number, said they don't know where to send people from the 12 to 19-year-old age gap, where the next level is past their doctor's surgery, and they get 10 minutes to sort of make a diagnosis. Living in Cornwall, which is down the southwest of England there, we do not have one dedicated unit for young adults or people 12 to 19 for them to go to have their needs met. It's appalling. And they are finally building one, and that's been brought about by a mum whose son committed suicide. He was sent to a unit 170 miles away from his parents and his family because there wasn't one near her. You know, that's terrible. And through the context of my work, I see my role now, because I'm kind of like coming to the end of the career, is to be as awkward and as annoying to the services and the government as possible, and say, this is not right. You can come up with all of these conclusions, but people need an end to that. And those kind of deficiencies makes jobs, people who do a similar job as Brandi in our country, impossible to work with.
But I think it's really important that we make it visible where these gaps are.
Yeah.
And they're so pervasive within the system. We all have experienced them on some level. We have the similar gaps here. We don't have a specific psychiatric unit or clinic specified just for youth issues. We also, when we're talking about intersectionality and recognizing that there are various levels of society, we're all very visible. We carry white privilege, and our voices are heard within this system. There are so many that are not, and we have to advocate also that not only our voices are heard about mental health issues, but that we are actively listening for those whose voices do not have a seat at the table, both literally and figuratively here. It's really important to address some of those gaps, and one of the projects that I've started here is a mental health initiative to start to identify those gaps and, in a very basic way say, how do we have systems, how do we start to provide connection within these gaps? Starting programs. There are many people who want to see these programs come to fruition, but there's a sense that the status quo is going to be maintained, and sometimes bringing forth these narratives, being that loud squeak in the system, can make sure that we're saying, no, this has to change. Do we have all of the answers? No. Do we have some of the data that starts to support that we can make rather simple solutions if we are working together using the resources we already have? Yes. So, through this initiative, we're just creating a simple one-stop registry for mental health support issues in the broadest sense of the word. So you may have heard things like wraparound services. What people need with their mental health needs is going to vary. Not everyone's going to want to see a psychologist or a psychiatrist. That may not be the mode of support that they need. Working with spiritual leaders in the community, working with kind of ancillary providing services that address kind of the full scope of your human needs. Sometimes it's not a therapist. Sometimes it's getting out and being active and being a human, in the social connectedness. We know that social connection is the number one factor for our longevity and outcomes in mental health. Before exercise and eating right, we are deeply social creatures, and we have to question the systems that lead us to believe that we are not connected, because that is one of the biggest factors, as I see it, that keeps us feeling alone in this mental health battle. And, one of the things, people like to say in my community is, a mind is a dangerous place to be in alone. Don't go in there alone. Go in there with support, because, sitting there can be a very dark place. And while I don't want to normalize that all those dark moments are, a place where it's mental illness, right? We also have just the human experience that we need to be connected with each other, connect with the narratives. We make sense through that, right? But we haven't really made sense of a real solid story or narrative of what does it look like when we get it right? What does it look like when we're connected to one another? When we are addressing that our biological needs are important, right? Our sleep, our exercise. How do we work with this whole technology thing in a healthy way?
And just talking about sort of sleep, exercise, and technology, if each of you could offer like a bit of advice to somebody in the audience who might know somebody who is suffering or is suffering themselves, either a parent or a student or a member of staff, how would you sort of offer that advice to be?
I know people who are going through tough times, but they don't like opening up. And I think it's really hard seeing people you know and you love suffer when you know that there's not much you can do except offer them your support. There's a point where they need to seek professional help, or at least you can't do anything more by yourself. And I think it's really, really hard watching your close friends suffer when you know that something's not right and you know that there's only so much you can do. And so I think to all the people who are like that right now, go seek help. If you're a student, go to the school counselor. They can refer you to a psychologist. You don't need to be mentally sick to go see a psychologist. If you're going through a tough time, go talk to a psychologist. It's so much more helpful than you think, and it's not something to be ashamed of.
Absolutely, and psychology is much more moving into this positive psychology of well-being. We want to make it part of integrated care. We want to make sure that people know that this is, there are many people I see who don't have diagnoses. They're just people who want to figure out how to make it work, how to feel more connected, how to have better relationships. We're talking about practical skills here, learning the right communication skills to overcome some of the social barriers that you're experiencing. that can be really, really, really helpful.
I'd first of all give them a really big cuddle and tell them that actually, if they want me to help them deal with these issues, I will do it, and I'll always be there for them. There are other people who will do that. And the first thing is to actually say, are there any practical difficulties that you're able to deal with as part of how you feel that I can take right off your hands straight away. And that thing that we talked about earlier, I've never had a conversation with someone who has depression about shame, who's had depression, who accepts it's reactive depression, it's caused by a series of events happening in their life. It always comes from within, and I feel it's because if they say it's reactive depression, then they're accepting some responsibility for the cause, and they don't want to because it brings out that shame. It's almost like you've got to get on with life and deal with that my generation grew up in. But no, definitely give them a cuddle and don't ever shut the door on that person. I remember my niece. She'd been stood up at the altar twice. Oh, it's just really terrible to be there in church, and the guy had turned around to her twice. And she reminded me one day, she said, it's men. She said, I met this lovely fellow, we went for a walk, and he tripped up, he fell in a river. She said, that's the story of my life with men. But she said, I've got to go back to work now. She'd been in the psychiatric hospital. And she said, I'm really worried, Kenny, about what people think. And I said, when you go in there, you just say to them, this is what's happened to me, and that's my life. And if you can't accept what's happened to me, then don't play any part in my life. I can only help people in it who see me as I am. And I was asked the question last night by Cathal, what the Eden Project where I work, the best thing it's done for me, and it was, and this is a very honest answer, it had accepted me for what I am, in my failings, when I am down. You know, I'm a bit of a nutcase quite often, because I want people to have a good time, I want a life. And anyone's seen the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, I deliberately take the people I support into the community and behave like that, because it's fun, you know. So it's a really unusual organisation that accepts me for what I am, and that's what we all need to do, accept everybody, each other for what we are. And of all the students that come to Cornwall from this school, the one thing we say to them is that we have a social and moral obligation to each and every one of ourselves, and we have to put that forward. No matter what statistics bring forward, it starts right at that person. That one there. There's the basis for it all, getting better.
If I was to offer my thoughts on how to deal with a friend, if you know someone who you think is struggling or a bit off, I think the most important thing is not to try and offer any solution. Because coming from when I was in my worst space, really, what I needed was to try and explain to someone what my world was like, people often will come up and say, is it something in school, is it something in sport, is it something in reality in your real life? But you're on a different dimension, that's not what it's nothing usually it's nothing, as you were saying, it's from within, you know? Yeah. So you need to just be with them and just try and listen and see what's bothering them on the inside, you know, because it's usually that.
I agree. Just bearing witness to that narrative is important, and just validating this is our humanity. This is our connection. I see a lot of people who get caught up in the shame or the notion that they're an imposition, but you are connected to all of us. We are all connected. We all know what this suffering feels like. And yet, when we feel it, somehow we feel like we're the only ones, you know. And oftentimes, you know, if you do ostensibly have, you know, lots of advantages in life, I think we also will get into that same pattern of guilt or shame for that. Oh, who am I to complain? People have it so much worse. instead kind of shifting into, yeah, I'm human and I feel it too. And when you're in the presence of someone else struggling, to just kind of say, yeah, I see that struggle, right? Not me too, I feel it too, and go into your own stuff, but just, I hear you. I'm right here right now. Right now I'm here. And I can see that experience you're having. There are wonderful programs in mental health first aid that I think we need to have more widely available. I think all of us should know how to respond in a mental health crisis. We all know how to respond if there's a fire drill today, right? Been very well trained in that way. But yet we're much more likely to come into daily contact with mental health issues. And the only modeling we've had for us is distance. They'll figure it out. It's okay, you know, maybe they just need space, right? I would encourage you that, you know, just saying, you know, I'm here. It's okay to have this conversation. And no, you don't have to be their therapist, but just being someone who can be there in that moment as they figure out what their needs are. That can be deeply healing, just to have that connection and that validation that, you know, at this moment, I see you. I see that it's not okay right now.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna fix that, but I see that it's not okay right now.
If I can just add, I know that we've been on this question for a while, but I think one thing I'd like to talk about is there's a lot there about when somebody else is dealing with something that's tough. But the reality is, as a now ancient 31-year-old, feeling increasingly more ancient the longer I'm out of school, I do want to remind you guys that life is hard. It is not easy. You will have ups and downs, you will have really bad days, you will have really great days. You'll fall in love, you'll be heartbroken, you will be broke sometimes you won't. That is just life. The difficulty is that when you try and do that alone, or you don't feel that you can talk to somebody else about that, nobody gets through life by themselves. It's just frankly impossible. And to Brandi's point, social isolation is the #1 indicator of somebody's eventual depression, anxiety, or suicidality. You take anybody in the world and you isolate them, which doesn't mean that they're physically alone in proximity. You can be in this room and not feel connected to anybody. That's isolation. And what terrifies me for anybody, particularly a young generation like yourselves, is that you have never known a world where an algorithm is not instructing you to shape your view of everybody else. You have grown up thinking that everybody's living their life exactly as they plan, and you're the only one that stuffs up when you're trying to ask out a girl you met in class or a boy you met in class, or fails their class assignment, or lost a job, whatever that is. We only share really good things online, and now that is everywhere. I think it's very difficult for you to understand your emotions, to understand who you are, if you are plugged into that all the time. And then when you do start to feel bad, when you're having a bad day, you're not feeling okay, you need that emotional support, it becomes incredibly hard to say to somebody else whose photos look amazing and their status updates are incredible, you know what, I'm actually not okay. Can we have a chat? Can you see me right now? Can I check in with you? And so I guess my somewhat sobering point is that expect a life that is hard, but a life that is also full of amazing things. And those amazing things happen when you have the support of people around you. And so as much as I think Lucas said this morning about connecting with people and meeting people today, that is the sort of thing you should be doing. It is very easy to think about that burning thing in your pocket that will connect you to people all around the world, and it's an amazing, amazing technological marvel. But as I said earlier, if you chart the rate of teen mental health issues and the rate of adoption of social media, there is a direct correlation. Every community that has the increased amount of social media has the least amount of romantic relationships. The reason being is because you get that hit of social interaction online, but it's not real.
Yeah.
It is much like, yes, I love ice cream, but if I eat ice cream every single day, I'm going to get sick. So I'd urge you to understand that life is ups and downs. Nobody else is living their life perfectly. You're not alone in that case. And wherever possible, just switch off from things, go for a walk, talk to people, and look at people like they are people.
Yeah.
You're not actors portraying a role in a great theatre.
And let's go even deeper on that one with, social connectedness, which we're driven to do, and social awareness, right? So I think oftentimes we're confusing our social awareness with social connectedness. Actual social awareness is tied with the plethora of problems that you're talking about, mental health issues, substance use, isolation, poor physical health, insomnia, etc. I think that we're starting to have a better idea of, okay, technology, not all evil, could help, it's being used in more innovative ways to have succinct, integrated interventions in our lives. But what we do notice is that social awareness going up, with this technology, that if we're overusing technology, we're actually taking away the natural occurrence of sitting with those tough moments, what we call distress tolerance, that we would naturally be learning by being bored, sitting with our problems. We don't have it because we are connecting with technology to avoid that and becoming hyper-aware of our social environment as opposed to actually connected.
That's quite a powerful statement to transition on, because we would now like to move on to a question and answer section of the panel.
Sure.
So there'll be just a few minutes where you can formulate some questions or post them on Twitter using the hashtag above me. So yeah, we'll be back in a few minutes to do some question and answer. There'll be roving mics. So.
Thank you for sharing your stories. Because we're in a school, I can't help but wonder, do you sometimes wonder if maybe we're teaching our youth the right things? Or are we missing serious skills like how to manage our minds, things like that? And maybe that should be not just biology and English and history as things that we're teaching. And I'd be curious as to what you think, especially from a student opinion. Thank you.
I think when I first started showing symptoms of depression, and I felt really isolated and alone, I taught myself how to deal with it because I hadn't learned anything from school, and everything I learned was in my own time. And I think the school is really making an effort through our PSHE, so Physical Social Health Education program, to teach us about it. But I think it's a bit too late. It's talking to us now in grade 11, and it's a great initiative. But I wish I had known all that, and I wish I had classes in school in grade 8, grade 9, because then I would have felt so much more comfortable going forward, telling a counselor I'm not okay, I need help. So I think we're on the right track, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done to help teach us that, and I think it'd be really valuable to all the students.
One of your teachers who visited our project, she wrote her thoughts afterwards, and she said, along the lines of, I will teach differently, having been here at People in Government, and that she realised that it's about exploring more, it's about connecting more, and having, and this was the key for me, having more fun. There's nothing wrong with putting super glue on your teacher's seat and they sit down on it, No, telling you to do it, have some fun. I'm at the age now where I'm going to have a lot of fun, really. Because I've spent the last 65 years dealing with all these issues that we've spoken about today, and I realise I got it wrong. I shouldn't have worried so much. The world doesn't change because I'm lying on the bed feeling that I want to commit suicide. It doesn't change at all. The person thinks with me that they're close to me. So teachers should have a lot more fun. I think it was my personal experience. And certainly. I'm in trouble.
I would also recognize that this is one of the systems that we're talking about. The school is part of it, and acknowledge that as being part of this bigger system, it has embodied these silencing systems. We all have, right? And so we need to recognize opportunities to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, be comfortable with sitting with messy situations and inconvenient timing of emotional issues, and normalizing that that's life. It gets messy, and yet we can start to create safe spaces where that's normalized, where we go, yeah, this person needs support right now, and actually that is important. We need to learn to build not only the distress tolerance skills, but an awareness of these are my needs. These needs don't go away. I can suppress them. They're needs. They're intrinsic needs. They're going to keep coming back. They're going to pop up at increasingly inconvenient moments. So when we actually recognize and validate that when our needs come up and they need to be expressed, one, it's our responsibility to start to learn how to express those. But I think as a system, we need to recognize, we need to find ways to allow that and celebrate that and say, yeah, this person's recognizing a need, I see that need, and we're going to adjust the system accordingly. And I think that the more that you have that, the more we're meeting needs as they're emerging, instead of, let's just go until we can't go anymore, right? That's where we're seeing these, exhaustion, like full-on burnout, because we're going like, I'm just gonna keep maintaining. And if you have enough, protective factors, you can do that for a good stretch of time, but there are real costs. And I think what we're trying to say here is, what if we did that differently? What if we normalize that our needs are ever present, and the more we have time to actually take a step back and reflect on those needs and learn communication skills to get those needs met, and us with the power within these systems are flexible to try to meet those needs, then we can maybe start to shift the dynamic of the system entirely.
If I can just share a quick personal story that relates to that and what you just talking about, Brandi. So I was 12 when I came close to suicide. I'd been quite sick with the illness before that, which led to being at home away from school for most of the year in social isolation. And got to a point where that seemed like the only way to get out of it. I was very lucky that I didn't end up losing my life. And then throughout my teenage years, I had half a dozen different antidepressants that I was on. I was quite lucky that my mum was very into mindfulness, meditation, and some other perhaps less scientifically proven things, but taught me a lot about, she was a hippie is what I'm saying, but she taught me a lot about understanding your own emotions and being in that place. And it was just a case that I had a predisposition towards depression that I had to deal with through my teenage years, which are, as you guys know, a turbulent time. And then once I hit my 20s, I was fine. Met a couple of guys, we started a non-profit around mental health, and I started to speak a lot about this, to work on this, and really dive into the field. And then last time I was in Switzerland, which was in September last year, and I was at the Water Forum headquarters on a panel much like this, talking about burnout and success and managing time and everything. And I'd flown just to Singapore a few weeks earlier, then back to Australia, then to Switzerland. We had a new company that we launched while running the non-profit, campaigns around foster care, LGBT rights and all those things. And then, and just so happened that my mum passed away 9 months ago. A month before that, a friend of mine had killed herself. And I was sitting on this panel and I was talking about how I was feeling, and I turned to the moderator and I said, yeah, I'm burning out. And it only just hit me then. And what I then had to go do was take a few days, my brother's apartment in Amsterdam, and go back to what I'd been taught as a kid. How do I feel? Check in with myself. What are the homeostasis things that aren't working? Am I getting enough sleep? Am I exercising? What am I eating? And true enough, none of those things were correct. And I I suppose my point is that I do really appreciate the lessons I was taught as a kid. And I don't think I would be here if I hadn't been given those gifts of knowledge, of mindfulness and emotional understanding. And so, yes, as a system, you need access to services. And talking to somebody about that mourning period was incredibly important for me. But the ability to understand what I was dealing with was incredibly important as well. And so I think at the same time that we create those services, it is the absolute responsibility, I believe, of parents and teachers and any adult role model within the circle of young people to teach them to understand, much like you would sexual health, any sort of fitness, or how to cook. How do you understand your emotions? And how do you understand how you're feeling in any given moment? If we don't do that, you're throwing kids out into the world that they can't possibly cope with. So.
Yeah. If it's okay. This won't take long. But just to add to this, basically what you're saying, what you got was what we did not get in school in Ireland. And just kind of, it's kind of humorous in hindsight, but I was diagnosed with an underactive thyroid and sports-induced asthma all through my teens. And then I found out when I was 22 that both of those were misdiagnoses, having taken medication for my underactive thyroid, and it was just chronic anxiety. And that's GPs, that's teachers, that's as in mental health was not in the spectrum of thought. You know, like as Gavin Mata says, like we completely separate mind and body. So it wasn't even in question, how are you actually feeling? Is that causing any of this? And it was causing all of it, you know. So it has to be in schools, definitely.
To quickly add to that, both my parents are doctors, and since I was maybe 4 or 5, I've had really bad anxiety, and we used to fight all the time, and it would end with me in tears on the floor, like at 7 in the morning when I was getting ready for school. And they always thought I had anger issues, which I don't. But so they took me to a bunch of psychologists, and I was never diagnosed with anxiety until my depression came out, and I went to see a psychologist, and I talked to her, and we did 2 different tests, and she's like, you're suffering with depression, but you're also suffering with anxiety, but they're not linked. Your anxiety's been here since you were a little kid. And when I told my mom, she's like, it finally makes sense. And she's a doctor, she should know. She's not a psychologist, but even as a doctor, you usually know some of the symptoms. She always assumed it was something else, and it never crossed her mind it could be anxiety. And when I told her, it just all made sense. So I just thought to add on to it.
I think this is where we see definitely these gaps emerging. I mean, this should be standard of practice, these kinds of screeners, whether through our technology, as is very, very possible today, but also, any interaction. We know that anyone who completes death by suicide, that there is a high rate that person has interacted with someone in the health realm within a month before that death. And so what we can do is make this part of our ongoing screening process. We're not talking about excessive testing here. There are very specific pointed questions of conversations we need to have. We need to normalize having, and it really can save lives. And providing training to people who are interacting, whether that's mental health or say, whether that's knowing how to do these basic screeners to open up the conversations, can make a real difference in finding out, what's going on with someone at the early onset instead of waiting until the human suffering is so very evident. And these things are all within our grasp. Using technology to help our well-being is also in our grasp, using it as a tool.
Do we have any other questions? Yes, that's one of the backgrounds.
I hope this doesn't sound rude, but because mental health issues have become such a big or open topic to talk about, do you think that it's easier to fall into depression or other issues?
It's funny that question was asked last night as well. A number of times. No, that's great. Great minds think alike and all. I think Brandi would have some interesting comments, but my perspective on that would be You don't get cancer by talking about cancer, right? We understand that. Depression itself is a clinical diagnosed condition. If you are around a lot of depressive situations, then yes, you can slowly go towards depression. But it's not like saying to somebody depression, well suddenly you'll catch depression. I think that there is, though, an emerging misunderstanding of all this, that your life is a series of ups and downs, and you have bad days and good days, and what is differentiation between a bad day and actual depression? I think on top of that, there is a growing trend of particularly in youth, a lack of identity and knowing how to interact with the world around them. And the easiest way is to take on the moniker of, well, I'm a depressed person, even if they're not actually clinically depressed. However, they're probably dealing with something else. That is, whilst not depression, might be social anxiety, for instance, they're taking that on. So I don't think it's a huge risk that you can create depression by having more conversation around depression. In fact, quite the opposite. But I do think that there is, tied up with depression and the growing rate of mental illness, a severe lack of identity, social understanding that's leading to, well, maybe this explains everything.
You can be dragged down by living with someone with depression. It's kind of part of your...
And that's that connectedness, right? I mean, we're even physiologically, I mean, interpersonal neurobiology is showing that, like, we physiologically regulate with one another. So, yeah, if you're sitting with someone with depression, are you gonna feel that? If you're connected, yeah. Does it mean that you're gonna become depressed? No. There are various, we have in psychology a biopsychosocial model that shows that there are actually many roads to depression. Yes, there are people who have a biological predisposition, there are psychological patterns, cognitive patterns people can get into that contribute to it. There are definitely social and these systemic issues that contribute to it. So I think having the conversation in a more nuanced way can let you know, hey, these are my stress factors, these are my factors that make me vulnerable, these are the things I need to pay attention to, and these are the factors that I can also manage to keep it at bay, but recognize you are also human. Depressive symptoms are not something that you're going to absolve yourself from. You're not going to do these things and inoculate yourself from the human experience. You're going to feel anxiety. You're going to feel depression. Are you going to have it on a clinical level, and should the rates that we're seeing them be normalized? Absolutely not. And so I think this is where it gets very blurry, is it's like, oh, if you're having a depressive symptom and you're depressed and let's create some distance because we don't know and we've been socially trained to create distance from that. Instead, let's say, yeah, that's pretty human. Let's talk about how bad it really gets, right? And that's more, for the professionals in my field to kind of help you parcel out, well, what was the end roads to getting here for you, right? There are many impacts, and this is just depression as an example, but it's the same for many different mental health issues.
Will, you said something really interesting that resonated with me. He talked about how we're becoming more immune to like the differences between like regular emotions, like grief is an emotion, but then you can have like a clinical, like depression is like a clinical. And you were saying how you kind of go like this, if you fluctuate, you can have good days, bad days. And people will have a bad day and say, oh, I'm so depressed. But depression is actually when you have a bad day and it just keeps getting worse and it never gets better. And so I think there's a lot to sort of answer your question, I guess. There's a lack of understanding between just having a bad day and getting ready for another good day, and having a bad day and it just never getting better and you just keep getting worse. So I think that's a problem nowadays, that people don't really understand their feeling emotions that well, and
Well, and it's paradoxical too, right? The very things that you need when you're depressed are the things that you fight tooth and nail, right? You need to connect socially, and you withdraw. It would feel good if you went out and you had some time with your friends, but you decide to stay at home. These kinds of things are helpful to keep in mind. Our own patterns and how that comes up, to recognize, oh, okay, if I'm going to break this pattern, I'm going to have to go towards the things. I'm going to have to get regular sleep. I'm going to have to eat more consistently. I'm going to have to reach out things are important, and to recognize that that's a normal process, this paradoxical approach.
I think to your question, exactly what you just articulated, there's a big difference between being unfulfilled and depressed. And I would actually posit that most people in a highly connected, modern, developed society are unfulfilled, and their needs are not being met. You look at the number of hours people spend watching television or on their smartphones, on social media, not exercising, not eating healthily. All those things will lead to a state where you're not depressed, but you're also not like, gee whiz, life is fantastic. And so what do? Back to Brandi's point before, you distract yourself from that by doing more of those things, eating more of that ice cream, as opposed to going out to eat something healthy and exercising and so on. So, to summarize, I do think there is a trend to explain away the ills of modern life by saying depression, which then can trivialize the actual diagnosis of depression.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for the Q&A session, so I'd like to, it's been an incredibly impactful and powerful discussion, so I'd like to offer a round of applause to both the audience